Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are doing something that feels, well, a little bit like science fiction.
It really does.
But I assure you, the source material we're looking at is very real. We were kind of stepping into a time machine here.
Right.
I wanted to just picture the date for a second. It is February 28th, 2026.
So it's a Saturday, and, the world looks mostly the same.
Yeah.
You've got the same buildings, the same traffic, but the political and, I guess, the biological landscape of the United States has undergone what you can really only describe as a seismic shift.
Totally. And the way we are analyzing this shift is through a very specific artifact from this timeline.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking at a transcript of the Joe Rogan experience,
Right.
specifically episode number 2461.
And the guest is Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Right. But in this reality, he isn't running for office.
Yeah, he's not.
He isn't an outsider throwing rocks at the institution anymore. He literally is the institution.
Exactly. He has been the Secretary of Health and Human Services for roughly 1 year under the second Trump administration. Which is just a wild context to keep in mind as we go through this.
It is. And this interview, it really isn't just a polite check-in or, a victory lap.
Right, it's dense.
It reads way more like a State of the Union address, but specifically for the biological reality of the American people.
Yeah.
And you really have to remember the context here. Kennedy is managing the largest budget in the entire federal government.
Just massive.
We are talking about over $1.7 trillion.
It's hard to even fathom that number.
Just to put that in perspective for you, that is larger than the entire GDP of Australia.
Wow.
Or Spain. Or Mexico.
So $1.7 trillion. That is a staggering amount of money.
Yeah.
And the picture he paints in this transcript of what he found when he walked through the doors of HHS back in early 2025.
It's honestly shocking.
It really is. We aren't just talking about, minor policy tweaks here or adjusting some tax credit.
No, not at all.
We're talking about actual Cuban crime rings running ghost medical supply companies out of empty hotels.
We're talking about lasers, like literal sci-fi lasers being used to zap weeds on farms so we don't have to use chemicals anymore.
Sounds made up.
It does. And we're talking about a fundamental rewiring of how Americans eat, how they heal, and even how they are allowed to speak to one another.
It's an incredibly dense, target-rich conversation.
Yes, target-rich.
And our mission for this deep dive today is to unpack it layer by layer.
Exactly.
We need to look at the structural changes Kennedy claims to have implemented.
Yeah.
We need to dissect the massive fraud he says he uncovered. And we really need to understand the economic shifts that have basically turned the pharmaceutical industry completely upside down.
I actually love that phrase he used right at the top of the interview.
The target-rich environment.
Yeah, target-rich environment.
It's a military term usually.
Right.
It usually means an area with lots of enemy combatants.
Sure.
But in this context, it's Kennedy's polite way of saying, well, this agency was such a disaster that I couldn't miss.
Right.
Like everywhere I looked, there was something broken or corrupt or just totally inefficient that needed fixing.
So let's start right there, the diagnosis phase.
Okay.
Kennedy walks into the Department of Health and Human Services. He sits down in the big chair. What does he actually see?
Well, according to him, he sees a system that is fundamentally mislabeled.
Okay, how so?
His primary argument is that the agency wasn't practicing healthcare, it was practicing sick care.
Sick care. We hear that distinction a lot in these debates, but break that down for us. What does that actually mean in terms of hard policy?
Well, healthcare is about preventing illness, right? It's about maintaining vitality and resilience.
Sure.
Sick care, on the other hand, is about monetizing the management of disease after it has already taken hold in the body.
I do.
And Kennedy throws out some pretty brutal numbers in the source material to back this up.
He does.
He notes that the United States spends about $4.3 trillion annually on health.
Which is just, I can't even visualize $4.3 trillion.
Yeah. It's immense. It's almost unquantifiable for a normal person.
Yeah.
And the kicker here is the return on investment.
Right. What are we getting for that money?
Exactly. Despite spending 2 to 3 times more per capita than other developed nations, the U.S. has the sickest population with the highest chronic disease burden in the world.
That's a rough statistic.
It is. But Kennedy admits, and this is a crucial nuance in the transcript, he says the U.S. is the best place on earth if you get hit by a bus.
Right. If you need emergency surgery, we have the best trauma centers, the best ERs.
Exactly. Our emergency medicine is absolutely top tier.
Okay.
But if you want to avoid getting diabetes or heart disease or autoimmune issues, or cancer.
Yeah.
He argues it's statistically one of the worst places to be.
Wow.
So the diagnosis is basically that the system is great at stapling you back together, but it's terrible at keeping you from falling apart in the first place.
But before he could even get to the health outcomes, he had to deal with the money.
Oh.
And specifically, the theft of that money. This part of the interview really felt like we were reading a script for a crime thriller.
Oh, absolutely. The industrialized fraud. That's the specific term he uses.
Industrialized fraud. It sounds a bit hyperbolic, honestly, but then he starts dropping the actual number.
Yeah, he estimates that the system loses roughly $100 billion a year just in Medicare and Medicaid fraud alone.
Hold on. $100 billion.
What?
With a B.
With a B.
That's not a rounding error. That's the entire GDP of a mid-sized nation. It's just completely vanishing into thin air every single year.
And he emphasizes that it's not just, clerical errors.
Right.
Or doctors accidentally double billing for a routine checkup.
So what is it?
It is organized transnational crime.
Okay.
The example he leads with is what he calls the Cuban connection down in Florida.
This was wild to read. Walk us through the mechanics of that. How do you steal that much money without anyone noticing?
Okay, so it's a scheme involving durable medical equipment, DME.
Right. So we're talking...
We're talking knee braces, wheelchairs, oxygen concentrators.
Got it.
Kennedy describes finding a specific hotel in Florida, just a standard everyday hotel.
Yeah.
And it had 129 rooms.
Okay, 129 rooms.
And every single one of those 129 rooms was legally registered as the corporate headquarters for a different medical supply shell company.
So it's basically a ghost hotel. 129 fake businesses sitting under one roof.
Precisely. The operators set up these P.O. boxes.
Right.
Then they go out and buy patient identification numbers on the black market.
Oh, wow.
Stolen data from real Medicare recipients. Maybe from a hospital data breach or a hack somewhere.
Okay, so they have real IDs.
Yes. And then they start billing the government for expensive wheelchairs and back braces attached to those real patient IDs.
But the patients never actually get the wheelchairs.
No, of course not. The patients usually don't even know they've been billed.
Right.
It's pure extraction. The government computers just see a valid patient ID and a valid provider ID, and the algorithm automatically cuts the check.
That is infuriating.
And Kennedy claims that when the feds finally raided these operations, the rooms were totally empty.
Just empty rooms.
The operators who he suggests are often directly linked to the Cuban government had already laundered the money and fled back to Cuba.
So essentially, the American taxpayer is unwittingly subsidizing a foreign regime through medical billing fraud.
That is the direct allegation he makes in the interview.
Oh.
And it wasn't just Florida either.
Right. He detailed the Russian hospices in Los Angeles next.
Yes.
Which, I have to say, Russian hospices sounds like the title of a really bad spy novel.
It does sound like fiction, but the reality is much grimmer.
Yeah.
It's a fraud ring allegedly run by Russian organized crime out in L.A.
Okay.
And they were generating more billing for hospice care, which is end-of-life palliative care in the city of Los Angeles alone, than in the entire rest of the United States combined.
Wait, that is statistically impossible. You cannot have more dying people in one single city than in the entire rest of the country.
It is completely impossible. But the system was designed in a way that the checks just kept clearing anyway.
Unbelievable.
And then there was the Minnesota Autism Scheme.
Right.
Which is perhaps the darkest example he gave, because it actively exploits the idea of helping vulnerable children.
This involved the Somali community in Minneapolis, right?
Correct. Organized rings were reportedly claiming that thousands of Somali children in Minnesota had severe autism.
Okay.
And that they required intensive, highly expensive care services.
And obviously, if kids need help, the government wants to pay for it. Nobody wants to be the politician saying no to an autistic child.
Of course not. And that's exactly the shield the fraudsters used to protect themselves.
Right.
But the math simply didn't work. Kennedy says the state originally projected this specific program would cost about $3 million a year.
Okay, $3 million.
In reality, it ballooned to $400 million over 3 years.
From $3 million to $400 million, that is just an explosion of spending.
It creates a massive gaping drain on the entire system. And the obvious question you have to ask, and Joe Rogan asked this too in the transcript, is who is watching the store?
Yeah.
How does a $3 million program become a $400 million program without a giant red light flashing on someone's dashboard?
And Kennedy had a pretty sharp answer for that. He didn't mince words at all.
No, he placed the blame squarely on the previous administration's staffing priorities.
Right.
He claims that under the Biden administration, the Program Integrity Office was completely gutted.
And the Program Integrity Office, that's like,
Think of them as the Internal Affairs Division for Medicaid.
okay, the cops of the system.
Exactly. He says their staff was reduced from hundreds of investigators down to just 6 people.
6 people.
Okay.
To police a $1 trillion budget.
Yes.
That is literally like having one single security guard for the entire Pentagon.
He argues the directive was purely political. The message was, focus entirely on enrollment. Get people signed up. Expand the safety net. And whatever you do, don't let fraud investigations slow down the distribution of those funds.
So it's quantity over quality. Get the money out the door, worry about where it went later.
And the individual states didn't have much incentive to stop it either.
Why not?
You have to understand the flow of the funds. If the federal government is pouring $400 million into Minnesota or California, that's money circulating in the local economy.
Oh, I see.
It pays salaries, it pays rent for buildings. Why would a local governor turn off the tap if the feds are the ones footing the bill?
That makes a dark kind of sense. So how does he claim to fix it in 2026? You can't exactly just hire 1,000 trained detectives overnight.
Technology. This is the first major structural shift he discusses in the interview.
Okay.
They implemented advanced AI systems to detect these fraud patterns in real time.
How does that work?
Well, an AI can look at a hotel address in Florida and instantly see that 129 companies are registered to that exact same building.
Right. A human might miss it, but the computer sees it instantly.
Exactly. It flags the anomaly in a nanosecond before the check is ever cut.
And he's using the power of the purse against the states too, right?
Very hardball tactics. He is actively withholding federal reimbursements.
Wow.
He's going to states like New York, California, and Maine, and he's telling them, look, we have audited you. We believe 50% of this specific spending is fraudulent.
And so
Until you show us a formal corrective action plan, the federal checks stop, period.
I have to imagine that is causing some serious political friction.
It's an absolute war. Kennedy frames this as a bizarre political realignment.
How so?
He says that stopping theft has somehow become a partisan issue.
That's crazy.
He claims blue states are refusing to cooperate, that they are viewing these financial audits as deliberate attacks on their social safety nets.
While he views it as just basic accounting.
Exactly.
It really sets the tone for the whole interview, doesn't it? Common sense issues becoming intensely polarized.
It's a recurring theme.
But let's move from the outright theft to the actual business model of medicine.
Yep.
Because Kennedy dropped an analogy about Lloyd's of London that really made me stop and rewind the source material. It was such a clear way to explain a really complex problem.
It is a brilliant way to explain perverse incentives.
Walk us through it.
So he asks Rogan to imagine he's an insurance executive at Lloyd's of London, and his job is ensuring maritime shipping.
Okay, so I'm sitting at a desk insuring cargo ships crossing the Atlantic.
Right. And he asks the question, do you make more money if 1 ship sinks or if 1,000 ships sink?
Yeah. Now, my gut reaction, and I think most people's reaction, is 1 ship. I don't want to pay out claims. If ships sink, I have to pay out, so I lose money.
That is the logical assumption.
Right.
But Kennedy argues the exact opposite is true.
Why?
If only 1 ship sinks, the insurance business is incredibly boring. Premiums are low because the overall risk is low.
Right.
The total volume of money moving through the insurance system is very small.
But if 1,000 ships sink?
Panic. Total panic in the market. Every shipping company on Earth scrambles to buy maximum coverage.
Right.
Premiums absolutely skyrocket. The total pool of money in the insurance market explodes.
Ah, I get it.
As the insurer, you take a percentage slice of that total volume. You want the volume to be as huge as possible. You make your money on the friction and the overall flow of cash.
So applying that analogy directly to American healthcare.
The ships sinking are sick Americans.
Wow.
If everyone is perfectly healthy, the volume of money flowing through hospitals, pharmacies, and insurance companies dramatically shrinks.
Right.
But if everyone has a chronic disease, diabetes, heart conditions, autoimmune disorders that requires daily medication and monthly doctor visits for 40 years,
Then the volume is massive.
the volume is astronomical.
So the entire industry is structurally designed to profit from the volume of sickness, not the result of health.
That is the fee-for-service trap.
Fee for certain.
Yes. Doctors and hospitals get paid for doing things. They get paid for ordering blood tests, prescribing drugs, performing surgeries.
Right.
They do not get paid for curing you. In fact, curing you permanently removes you from their revenue stream.
That's
A cured patient is a lost customer.
That is a terrifying realization when you put it that way. It totally explains why we have so much management of disease in this country and so little reversal of disease.
Exactly.
So what is his 2026 solution to this structural trap?
Kennedy is pushing hard to flip the payment model to what is called a flat fee model, or capitation.
Explain that mechanism for us. How does that change the incentive?
In a flat fee model, the government, or the private insurer, pays a healthcare provider a set amount of money up front.
Like a salary.
Sort of, say, $10,000 a year, specifically to manage one patient's overall health, period. That is the entire budget for that person.
And what happens if the patient gets really sick?
The cost of that expensive treatment comes out of that $10,000 bucket.
Mm.
Suddenly, the financial polarity completely reverses. Now, the doctor is financially incentivized to keep you healthy.
Right, because they keep whatever they don't spend.
Exactly. They actively want you to eat well, to exercise, to avoid the heart attack, because the heart attack costs them money now.
It turns the doctor from a mechanic who gets paid to fix car crashes into a driving instructor who gets paid to prevent them from happening at all.
That's a great way to put it. It's all about aligning the financial interest of the system with the biological interest of the patient.
But, you really can't have a functional market without knowing the prices.
Right.
And this brings us to the menu concept in the transcript. Price transparency.
Yeah.
It sounds kind of boring on paper, but Kennedy insists it is totally revolutionary.
He uses the car dealership analogy to explain it.
Okay.
Imagine going to a car dealer, picking out a brand new Ford, driving it home, and driving it around for a month.
Sounds nice.
And you do all of this without ever seeing a price tag. And then a month later, you get a bill in the mail.
Right.
Maybe it's $20,000. Maybe it's $80,000. You had absolutely no way of knowing beforehand.
That is exactly how hospitals work right now. You sign a piece of paper at the front desk, promising to pay whatever, and you find out the actual damage weeks later when the letter shows up.
Kennedy describes the implementation of a strict post-your-prices policy. Hospitals now face massive federal fines if they don't have a fully public menu of their services.
And the data they found when they finally turned the lights on and forced this.
It was shocking.
The variance in prices, you mean?
Massive, inexplicable variance. He talks about a government website they built where you can now comparison shop.
Okay.
He said he looked up the cost of delivering a baby in Manhattan.
A pretty standard procedure.
Right. At one hospital, the listed price was $1,300.
Okay, that seems reasonable.
At another hospital, literally 1 single mile away, for the exact same delivery service, it was $22,000.
That is insane. $1,300 versus $22,000 for the exact same outcome.
And it gets worse. In Detroit, he saw prices ranging up to $60,000.
For a standard delivery.
Yes. This isn't economics anymore, it's chaos.
It really is.
He calls it a predator system that entirely relies on the fact that the consumer is blind to the price.
Right.
By forcing transparency, they aim to create an actual functional market where real competition drives the prices down naturally.
Speaking of driving prices down, we absolutely have to talk about the drugs.
Trump RX.
Yes, Trump RX. We've heard rumors about this kind of policy in the news over the years, but the specific numbers he dropped in this 2026 interview were jaw-dropping.
This whole policy hinges on a concept called MFN. That stands for Most Favored Nation status.
So get that down for us. It sounds more like trade law than healthcare.
Well, it essentially is trade law applied directly to medicine.
Okay.
For decades, the United States has effectively subsidized the entire world's drug development. We pay top dollar for everything.
Right.
Meanwhile, countries in Europe go to Big Pharma and they say, look, we are a single-payer system. We represent entire nations. We will pay you exactly X amount for this drug. Take it or leave it.
And pharma usually takes it.
They do. They take the lower profit margin in Europe just to cover their marginal production costs.
And then what?
And then they severely gouge the American consumer to make all their massive profits and cover their global R&D budgets.
So we, the American taxpayers, are essentially paying for France's cheap medicine.
We were.
Right.
Under the new policy Kennedy describes, the U.S. government now says, we will not pay 1 single cent more than the lowest price you offer to any other developed nation.
Wow.
So if Germany pays $50 for a pill, we pay $50.
That's a huge shift. What's the actual impact of that on the ground?
The primary example Kennedy gives in the interview is Ozempic.
Oh, the weight loss drug. Literally everyone knows it.
Right. The list price in the U.S. was floating around $1,350 a month.
Okay.
Under the new MFN pricing, it dropped to roughly $88.
From 1,350 to 88.
Yeah.
That is, I mean, that's not even a discount. That's a total market correction.
It's math.
That fundamentally changes the lives of people who are paying out of pocket for that.
He also mentions IVF fertility drugs.
What happened there?
He gave an example of those dropping from $4,000 a cycle down to $600.
Wow.
It is literally making families possible for people who simply couldn't afford to have children before.
But here's the puzzle, and this is the part of the transcript where I really needed to stop and think.
Okay.
Usually, when the government steps in and forces prices down like that, the industry screams socialism and pharmaceutical stocks completely crash.
Right.
But Kennedy claims in the interview that pharmaceutical stock values actually went up by $1.3 trillion. How is that even mathematically possible?
This is what they call the win-win paradox, or what Kennedy refers to as the grand bargain.
Okay, explain the bargain.
The administration didn't just aggressively cut domestic prices. They played geopolitical hardball.
How so?
They forced Europe to pay more to balance the global scales.
Wait, so our prices went down and Europe's prices went up?
Yes, it was a global leveling of the market. But more importantly than that, they offered Big Pharma something they value over everything else. Certainty.
Certainty.
Yes. They offered long-term guaranteed government contracts and massive tax incentives. But there was a catch.
What was the catch?
The companies had to onshore their production. They had to bring the manufacturing back to the United States.
Oh, I see.
Kennedy claims companies like Eli Lilly are currently building massive state-of-the-art factories in the U.S. right now because of this.
Interesting.
The stock market loves certainty and it loves volume. Even if the profit margin on a single pen of Ozempic is lower, the guaranteed volume and the tax breaks make them incredibly profitable.
So the end result is we get cheaper drugs, we get domestic manufacturing jobs back, and pharma still makes a ton of money.
That's the claim.
It sounds almost too good to be true.
It is extremely aggressive negotiation. It's essentially treating national health policy like a global trade war. Kennedy effectively told the pharmaceutical executives, you can still make money, but you're going to make it on our terms, and you're going to make it right here in America.
All right, so we've covered the drugs, we've covered the doctors and the fraud.
Yep.
Now let's talk about the fuel for the human body. Segment 3 of our outline, the food.
The food system.
And this section of the transcript starts with a story about Fruit Loops that I frankly thought was a joke at first.
Not a lot of people did.
I literally had to pause the transcript to make sure I wasn't reading some kind of internet parody.
The Fruit Loops revelation.
Yes.
It sounds funny on the surface, but it's deeply indicative of the systemic corruption in the regulatory system.
Okay, lay it out.
Kennedy claims that when he first took office, he looked at the USDA food pyramid guidelines.
The guidelines that dictate school lunches and everything.
Exactly. And he found that the government's official algorithm was actually ranking Fruit Loops cereal higher than natural single-ingredient foods like whole eggs or whole milk.
How does a bowl of artificial red dye, highly processed flour, and refined sugar beat a natural egg from a chicken?
One word, fortification. That is the magic loophole word.
Fortification.
The cereal companies take their processed product and they spray it with synthetic, lab-made vitamins.
Okay.
The scoring rubric that the government was using gave massive, disproportionate points for these added synthetic vitamins.
And what about the egg?
The algorithm heavily penalized the egg because it contains naturally occurring saturated fat.
That is wild.
So, according to the official government math, the ultra-processed sugar bomb was technically the healthier choice, purely because it had a synthetic dusting of vitamin C on it.
And this matters so much because it's not just friendly advice from the government, it's tied to money.
Huge amounts of money. These exact guidelines determine what the federal government buys for public school lunches and for the SNAP program.
Food stamps.
Right. Kennedy notes a terrifying statistic here. He says 70% of the calories in American children's diets today are made up of ultra-processed foods.
70%.
And if the government officially categorizes Fruit Loops as a healthy option, billions of taxpayer dollars automatically flow straight to the massive corporation that manufactures Fruit Loops.
So he is completely rewriting the food pyramid.
Yes. His team, which notably includes Dr. Mark Hyman.
Right, who has been a huge vocal critic of the processed food industry for years.
Exactly. Kennedy says they spent 11 grueling months fighting industry lobbyists. They had to go citation by citation through the science.
Just to fix the pyramid.
They had to entirely rebuild the dietary guidelines based on actual human biochemistry rather than corporate profit margins.
And this fight spills right over into the SNAP program.
It does.
Which is where this deep dive gets intensely controversial from a political standpoint.
Very controversial. They are aggressively pushing for federal waivers that would explicitly ban the purchase of soda and candy with food stamps.
And the core argument being made there is what?
Fiscal responsibility and basic logic. Kennedy argues, why on earth should the American taxpayer fund the purchase of liquid sugar, which directly causes metabolic dysfunction and diabetes, when that exact same taxpayer is then going to be forced to pay to treat that resulting diabetes via Medicaid 10 years down the line?
It's a closed loop of sickness and spending.
Exactly. He specifically calls it subsidizing our own destruction.
Now, he noted in the transcript that blue states, places like Vermont, are heavily resisting this SNAP waiver.
Yes, and he finds it absolutely baffling.
Why?
He specifically called out Senator Bernie Sanders in the interview.
Oh, did?
He openly wondered why a progressive icon like Sanders wouldn't want to fiercely protect low-income children from what he views as the predatory, toxic sugar industry.
Right.
It really highlights how deeply political tribalism can override basic public health logic.
Yeah.
Kennedy's view is that allowing SNAP boost to be used for soda isn't a benefit for the poor at all. He views it as a massive backdoor corporate handout to companies like Coke and Pepsi.
But the most tangible success story he shared in this food section was actually about the military.
Ah, the Chef Robert Irvine experiment.
Yes. This was a really human, relatable moment in the middle of all this policy talk.
It's a fantastic case study in actual execution. So
Right.
the military was basically feeding our soldiers standard, frozen, highly processed government chow.
Which I have to assume they absolutely hated.
They completely despised it. Kennedy vividly described the scene on these bases.
What's happened?
Soldiers were actively skipping meals at the official mess hall. They were going to the fast food franchises located on the base instead.
Right.
They were gaining weight, they were sluggish, and overall military readiness was measurably dropping.
So what did they do?
Chef Irvine came in and piloted a radical program. He switched the base completely from frozen, processed heat and serve trays to fresh, locally sourced, cooked from scratch meals.
Now, the assumption is always that healthy, fresh food means expensive food. That's the conventional wisdom we all hear.
That is the enduring myth. But the actual result of the pilot program, the daily food cost per soldier dropped from $18 a day down to $10 a day.
When it got cheaper.
Significantly cheaper.
How?
It turns out ultra-processed food has a massive hidden markup for marketing, specialized packaging, and complex logistics.
Oh, that makes sense.
Real food, raw potatoes, whole chickens, fresh vegetables is actually much cheaper if you just fix the procurement supply chain and cut out all the corporate middlemen.
And the result for the soldiers.
Lines are on the block for the mess hall. Morale skyrocketed overnight.
That's awesome.
Kennedy said the soldiers felt deeply respected because their country was finally putting the effort in to feed them real, nourishing food.
So we have a clear blueprint there.
We do.
But real food requires real farms.
Right.
And Kennedy, a guy who has spent a massive chunk of his life suing agricultural chemical companies, is now fully in charge of the health system that essentially relies on them.
Yes.
This is what we call the glyphosate dilemma.
Glyphosate is the primary active ingredient in Roundup weed killer.
Right.
Kennedy deeply believes it is pure poison. He cites numerous studies linking it to various cancers, severe gut microbiome issues, and the total degradation of our topsoil.
Okay.
But he also clearly knows the hard reality. 97% of U.S. corn and 98% of U.S. soy are genetically modified specifically to rely on this chemical.
So if you just ban it tomorrow with an executive order, the grocery store shelves go empty by next week.
Exactly. The weeds would instantly take over the fields, crop yields would violently crash, and we would face a literal immediate famine.
That's a huge problem.
And on top of the biological issue, there is a massive national security angle that he brings up.
Right. Where does it come from?
99% of our agricultural glyphosate is currently manufactured in China.
That is a terrifying choke point for our entire food supply.
It is. So Kennedy is caught in a serious bind here. He desperately wants to stop the use of the chemical for public health reasons, but he simply cannot ban it without causing domestic economic collapse or handing immense geopolitical leverage to a rival nation.
Enter the lasers.
Enter carbon robotics.
Yes.
This is genuinely the most futuristic sci-fi part of the entire interview transcript.
I loved this part.
Kennedy describes these massive, high-tech machines that get dragged behind traditional tractors.
Okay.
They use ultra-high-speed cameras and advanced artificial intelligence to scan the ground inch by inch.
Like a Terminator for weeds.
Exactly. The AI instantly identifies a tiny plant, distinguishes whether it is a crop or an invasive weed, and then zap.
They shoot it with a literal laser.
They use a targeted thermal burst to explode the weed. It hits the tiny growth center of the weed with intense heat, killing it instantly.
That is so cool.
No chemical spray,
Yeah.
no toxic runoff into the water, just highly concentrated light and heat.
It sounds incredibly cool, but does it actually pay? Like, is this a viable tool or just a fancy toy for rich hobby farmers?
Well, he cites a specific case study of an onion farmer in Texas.
Okay.
Her traditional historical cost for chemical herbicides and the manual labor required to weed her fields was about $1,500 an acre.
$1,500.
With the new laser robot, the cost dropped to $300 an acre.
That is an 80% reduction in operational cost.
Exactly. Plus, she reported that her overall crop yield actually went up by 30%.
Why would the yield go up?
Because the harsh chemical herbicides weren't stunning or damaging the actual onion plants anymore. The onions grew significantly bigger and healthier because they weren't constantly bathing in toxic spray.
So the technology provides the perfect off-ramp.
It does.
You don't need to pass a controversial law to regulate the chemical away. You just make it economically obsolete with a cheaper, better robot.
That is the ultimate hope. It bridges the difficult gap between massive industrial-scale farming and healthier regenerative agriculture. It's not about forcing farmers to go back to the 1800s with a hand hoe. It's about pulling them forward to 2030 with a laser.
Let's pivot from the gut to the brain.
Okay.
Because Kennedy made a really strong, explicit connection in the interview between what we eat and how we actually behave as a society.
The gut-brain axis, this is truly cutting-edge science right now.
Break it down.
He cited some fascinating data from pilot programs inside state prisons.
Prisons?
Yes, they ran controlled experiments where they simply removed the standard ultra-processed foods from the commissary and the cafeteria.
So no more deep-fried stuff, no more sugary energy drinks.
Right, and they replaced those calories with whole nutrient-dense foods.
And the result of that dietary shift?
A measured 50% reduction in violent incidents within the facility.
That is staggering. Half the fights, half the assaults on guards just gone. Purely from changing the lunch menu.
It profoundly challenges our entire cultural view of criminality.
How so?
It forces to ask how much of what we consider bad behavior or malice is actually a moral failing, and how much of it is severe biological inflammation caused by a toxic food environment.
Wow.
If your brain is constantly physically inflamed by dietary chemicals, your baseline impulse control severely drops.
That makes total sense.
He also mentioned the groundbreaking work of Dr. Chris Palmer over at Harvard.
What is he doing?
Dr. Palmer is using heavily controlled keto diets to effectively treat severe psychiatric conditions like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder.
Treating schizophrenia with a diet.
Yes, by shifting the brain's metabolic fuel source from glucose to ketones, it's revolutionizing psychiatry.
And speaking of revolutionizing psychiatry, we have to talk about the forbidden medicine.
Psychedelics.
Yes, psychedelics. Kennedy seems totally ready to open the floodgates here, but he's framing it very specifically around veterans.
He is very strategic about that, and I want you to notice who he proudly uses as his political shield on this issue. Rick Perry.
The very conservative former Republican governor of Texas.
Exactly. It completely demonstrates the wild bipartisan shift happening right now.
Right.
This isn't being framed as hippies getting high at a music festival. This is strictly framed as a desperate medical intervention for combat veterans who are dying of suicide every single day.
What specific compounds are they looking at?
Kennedy primarily describes ibogaine.
Right. That's from a plant, isn't it?
It's a very powerful psychoactive substance derived from a specific African root bark.
Okay.
And he is very careful to describe the experience not as a fun party drug, but as a severe ordeal.
He used that word specifically, ordeal.
Yes, he did. It is apparently a grueling, intensely difficult 24-hour physical and mental experience.
Oh.
It forcibly makes you confront your deepest traumas, but the clinical data suggests it can literally rewire the brain's neural pathways and completely break chemical addiction loops.
Specifically for opioids, right?
Yes, specifically for severe opioid addiction, often in just a single clinical session.
So the federal government is actually moving forward on this in 2026.
Yes. The VA is actively conducting massive clinical studies. HHS is rapidly writing new regulatory guidelines.
Okay.
They want to formally move these substances from the Schedule 1 list of highly prohibited illegal drugs straight into the clinical setting.
It's a huge shift.
They want to medicalize the mystical experience in order to save lives. It is a complete and total reversal of the 1980s war on drugs mentality.
Okay, so we've covered the body, the food, and the mind.
Right.
Now let's talk about the broader social environment. Segment 5 of our outline covers technology and speech.
Very important topics.
And they started this section with something that is apparently sweeping the nation in 2026, the bell-to-bell phone ban.
This is a major coordinated federal push to get smartphones out of public schools entirely during the instructional day.
So not just put it in your pocket or keep it in your locker.
No, completely locked away in a pouch.
Yeah.
From the moment the first morning bell rings to the moment the final afternoon bell rings.
Okay.
And Kennedy claims the pilot data from the schools trying this is just an absolute slam dunk.
What are they seeing?
Standardized test scores go significantly up, and severe disciplinary issues completely plummet.
That makes sense.
But the anecdote he shared that really stuck with me wasn't about grades. It was the cafeteria scene.
Ah, the sound of silence becoming the sound of noise?
Exactly. He described walking into a middle school cafeteria in Loudoun County. There were 600 kids sitting in there eating lunch.
Okay.
And he said it was incredibly loud.
Because they were actually talking to each other.
They were looking each other in the eye, they were arguing, they were laughing, they were actively engaging in real human friction.
Instead of just staring at glowing rectangles.
Right. He said the parents absolutely love it, and the teachers are thrilled. But again, he points out the strange political resistance to it. He claims that certain blue states are actively fighting the ban, seemingly simply because it is being pushed as a Trump administration initiative.
Which is just tragic, if true. Refusing to help kids just to score political points.
Yeah.
But the conversation in the transcript took a much darker turn when they discussed free speech.
It did.
Kennedy clearly has a very personal history with this topic.
He absolutely does. He famously points out that he was personally banned from Instagram exactly 37 hours after Joe Biden's inauguration back in 2021.
Wow, 37 hours.
He views the modern Democratic Party, which, keep in mind, is his own family's legacy party, as having totally abandoned the foundational principle of free speech.
And he and Rogan looked across the pond to the UK as a dire warning sign.
Yes.
They brought up something called the pub law.
This part is truly chilling to read. He describes recent legislation in the United Kingdom that makes private business owners, like a local pub landlord, legally liable if their staff simply overhears harassing conversations between two paying customers.
Wait, so if I'm at a bar having a beer and debating controversial politics with you, and the bartender walking by decides they're deeply offended by your opinion,
the owner of the bar can be financially sued.
so the owner's just going to ban all intense conversation on their property to protect themselves.
Exactly. It effectively outsources state censorship directly to the private sector through the sheer terror of civil litigation.
That's insidious.
Kennedy specifically calls it outsourcing truth. He also mentions the terrifying statistic that there were 12,000 formal police arrests in the UK over a single year purely for social media posts.
Formal arrests for tweets. That sounds like dystopian fiction, not modern Europe.
He argues passionately that when you allow the government or opaque tech algorithms to unilaterally decide what is objectively true, you instantly kill the necessary feedback loop of a healthy democracy.
Right.
And he actually praises long-form podcasts, specifically like Rogan's show, as the ultimate cultural antidote to this.
Because you can't really be a two-dimensional monster if I sit and listen to you talk for 3 straight hours.
Exactly.
I might vehemently disagree with your policies, but I have to acknowledge your basic humanity.
Nuance is the natural enemy of polarization, and long-form conversation forces nuance.
So let's try to wrap all of this up.
Okay.
We're looking at a snapshot of 2026, where hospitals have transparent menus, farm tractors shoot literal lasers at weeds, combat veterans are being treated with African psychedelic roots, and school kids are actually looking at each other during lunch.
It is a massive structural disruption of the status quo.
It really is.
At its core, it is a deliberate dismantling of agency capture.
Which means?
That historically cozy revolving door relationship between the federal regulators and the massive corporate industries they're supposed to be tightly regulating.
Right.
Kennedy is aggressively trying to flip the financial incentives so that the entire system finally profits from creating health rather than managing sickness.
And he leaves us and the listener with a final really provocative thought about the current political map.
The Great Realignment.
Yep.
He suggests in the interview that the historical party switch is now fully complete.
Break that down.
He notes that Trump essentially adopted the old-school, traditional liberal positions, being fiercely anti-war and fiercely anti-corporate trade deals.
Okay.
And now, Kennedy is inside the administration successfully making clean food, natural holistic health, and absolute free speech into conservative, coded issues.
Which is mind-bending if you grew up in the 90s or 2000s. If biological health and pure food become a right-wing value, and institutional safety and pharmaceutical reliance become a left-wing value,
Right.
where does that actually leave us as a society?
It leaves us in a totally unprecedented world where the old political labels simply do not apply anymore.
Yeah?
We might legitimately be witnessing the birth of a brand new political spectrum, one that is divided based on human biology and health rather than abstract economic ideology.
That is a fascinating, if slightly disorienting thought to chew on.
It really is.
Hopefully you're chewing on something organic and pesticide-free while you think about it.
Definitely.
That is it for this deep dive into the strange new world of 2026. Thanks so much for listening.
Stay curious.